This is Flashpoint, where power and politics collide and the tough questions get asked and answered.
Thanks for joining us here on Flashpoint. I'm Ben Thompson. This week we are talking transit. The transformational mobility network will impact thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Charlotteans, as well as people in the surrounding counties. It's a plan worth more than $13 billion. It would bring more rail lines, buses and routes, streetcar extensions, sidewalks, greenways, and more to the Queen City. As you're about to hear, some city leaders say we only have a few weeks to get the details worked out if they want to put it on a referendum in the November ballot. Local leaders working through how to put it in motion. Last week they were in Austin, Texas, to get a better sense of how that Texas capital got its transit plan done. But members of the Black Political Caucus say more has got to be done before this plan gets their full support. We'll talk to the chair of the caucus coming up in just a few minutes. But first, joining us today, Mayor Pro Tem Julie Eisel. She also happens to chair, for the purposes of this conversation, the Transportation and Planning Committee. It's been a few months since we've had you on, Mayor Pro Tem. Bring us up to date, behind the scenes. Is the city making any progress when it comes to transit?
Well, we're getting there, I believe. There's an incredible level of conversation going on between our mayor and the town mayors and our city manager and the town managers and Norfolk Southern, right? So until we get even putting the red line aside, until we get the northern towns on board, we really can't move forward. But I think they haven't said no, so I would consider that to be progress. But the General Assembly is going to have to approve putting it on the ballot, and there's no point asking for that if the towns aren't on board. So there is a timeline involved there. And I think it's quickly coming to that point. They're going to either have to say yes or no. And if it's yes, what do they want? And so I think that still remains to be seen what that's going to be.
You're talking about the timeline. It's this sales tax, this 1 cent sales tax that the city cannot enact in and of itself. It has to get permission from the folks, state lawmakers up in Raleigh, before you guys can put it on the ballot. Right. Hopeful that you would do that in November. You sort of answered my question, but is that still the hope?
Of course, yeah, it's still the hope, but I think there's also an acknowledgement that it might not, and that doesn't mean that we should stop trying. So I think that was one of the biggest takeaways from Austin, is they never stopped trying.
And if not this November, when would be the next chance, just so people know?
It could be the next year. Okay. It could be the following year. This is a big election year. Is that going to make a difference as to whether or not people agree to support a sales tax? So, I don't think we should look at it and say, if it's not done by this date, we are never going to get, funding for our transit plan. We have to just keep trying, and we got to try a plan B if there's no path forward at this point.
Procedurally, how much more time do you think you guys have if you want to get it in November?
I think it would be a matter of weeks.
Matter of weeks. Okay. You mentioned Austin. I want to talk about Austin. You're fresh off a trip down to the Lone Star State. You guys talked about a lot of things, transit being one of the big ones.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of a trip like this? What are your takeaways now that you're back here? You're talking to some of these same stakeholders. What are the benefits you got?
Well, so Austin, the interesting thing about Austin is that they went through a similar process as we did, but they started a lot earlier, which for them, they feel like was late, right? Their first referendum for their sales tax plan was in 2000, and that failed. They then had another one in 2004, and they did get what they call their red line. They got that out of it. And then they had another one to build out the whole system in 2014, and that failed. But they kept, you got to say this about Texas, and I've lived there, they don't take no for an answer very easily. And when they do something, they do it big and bold. And that was the message that Texans, the Austin community, I should say, the region really sent to them is, if you're going to do this, you need to do it big and bold, and we need to be a part of this process. And I think that was a really good message, is that, they failed a couple of times, but they got it passed eventually. They changed it. They were very focused on engagement. They had a coalition of over 60 organizations, nonprofit, business, community, neighborhood, that really did the education part of it for people, and brought back responses to what people wanted to see in the referendum.
Do you feel like you have people either also on council, but also regionally speaking, or up in Raleigh, that aren't willing to think big when it comes to transit?
Yeah, I'm going to be really honest about that. I've always said, we're a banking town, and what do bankers do best? They mitigate risk. So I think we think like that a lot. And sometimes we've just got to be willing to talk big, and find out if that is really what people want. Or listen to people, and if they come up with the big ideas, we need to really pursue that. The Austin plan was very data driven, very outcome driven. I think one of the big differences is that that I see between our plan. I have been a proponent of aligning the blue line with the silver line uptown. I just can't get my head around having two different stops 2 blocks apart and thinking people are going to make that transfer. I'm also very concerned about it not going right to the airport. Austin's doing that. So, I think that Austin said, fine, this is what we're going to do. And they went for it. They're tunneling through their uptown. Now, tunneling is very expensive. It's about $1 billion a mile. So I'm not sure that's what we need necessarily. But they had some big bodacious goals, and they met them. They split their tax 50-50. So that 50% of it would go to transit, the line itself, and 50% would go to bike and ped projects. So that it was actually 2 pieces on the ballot, and the 50% that included bike and pedestrian infrastructure passed by a larger margin, by 70% versus 60%. I thought that was interesting.
Real quickly, last question. While you guys were there, we heard from the Black Political Caucus, and they had some concerns about this, chiefly things like gentrification. And listen, we've seen this happen on the Blue Line already. And I know Austin's plan sort of works at that as well, as far as making sure that people are not displaced and making sure there's affordable housing. What would you say to their critiques of the current plan?
I think they're absolutely right. They're smart to get ahead of that conversation, since we don't really even have a coalition put together yet to help educate people and inform people and get feedback. Austin put aside $300 million out of their tax allotment. If it passed, they said $300 million is going to go to what they call their equity tool, which focuses on displacement and preventing gentrification. And that was a big takeaway. I thought that was a great idea. We've got to really get our head around buying land and sitting on it, which is hard to do when we could be using that money to buy properties right now. But that's the only way you're going to really preserve the land around the light rail for affordable housing, and so that people are not displaced.
Protect it for those folks. All right. Mayor Pro Tem, also chair of the Transportation Planning Committee, Julie Eisel. Julie, thank you as always for coming on. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben.
Have
Bye.
a good one. More Flashpoint after this.